Broadcasting live from Forward Observer Central Command in Austin, Texas. It's the man always out front on the issues. You're listening to Out Front with Samuel Culper.
Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to Out Front. I'm your host, Samuel Culper. As a reminder, I do this early morning podcast each day, Monday through Friday. On Mondays, I release the show in its entirety to the public via YouTube and the various podcast platforms. And then Tuesday through Friday, my show is available to Forward Observer subscribers. I cover a lot of interesting and important topics on this show, stuff that's not covered anywhere else because of our unique collection capabilities. And if you agree, and you'd like to get my daily early morning intel brief, along with our special reports, a new library section that we're about to publish to the website, and access to this daily podcast, then you can join us at forwardobserver.com. By the way, after a proof of concept / pilot program that we ran in October and November, we'll be launching in earnest, in full. We're launching Fox Company, which is our crowdsourced intelligence program. That's going to be in January. And that's going to allow us to track local, state, and regional threats and events as well. So for the past year or so, I've been looking at several ways on how we could begin producing basically like a state-level intelligence summary or maybe a regional intelligence summary. And after this trial program, we decided this is the way forward, and we'll be launching that next month. Now, let's get into today's early warning report. Here's your early warning for Monday, the 7th of December, 2020. We start off in Pennsylvania, where dozens of Republicans in the Pennsylvania state legislature are calling on members of Congress to block the state's electoral votes from going to Joe Biden. That process will take place in early January when Congress certifies the electoral voting process. Now, in addition to seeking legal wins through the court system, this is the second objective for the Trump campaign. They want to build a large political and social movement because state representatives who know that they are backed with popular support are more likely to join the effort to oppose the Electoral College victory for Joe Biden. Now, it is a long shot, but the Trump campaign views this as a second path to victory if they fail in the courts. I still think it's unlikely that President Trump remains president past January 20th, 2021. But this is not impossible. I've spent the weekend, I looked into a lot of these allegations of voter fraud, and they have, Rudy Giuliani has like somewhere between 800 and 1,000 affidavits from individuals who allege violations of their civil rights, i.e. not being able to observe the counting process, basically allegations of widespread voter fraud. And really the question is, can the Trump legal team get this through the courts? There are several cases that are pending at the state Supreme Court level. Many legal observers expect some of these, at least one of these cases, will go to the U.S. Supreme Court. This still has some time to play out. I still think it's unlikely, but it's not impossible. Moving on, there's a slight rift in the Senate. Attorney General Bill Barr appointed U.S. Attorney John Durham to continue investigating the origins of the 2016 Russian collusion investigation. That appointment means that he's going to remain special counsel to investigate even during a Biden administration. Senate Republicans and Senate Democrats are obviously at odds on whether a Biden administration should allow that to continue, and basically have Democrat senators coming out and say Biden should end this. It's Senator Chris Murphy, the Democrat from Connecticut, said that it was bat-esque crazy that this continued. And so this may become a point of contention early in the Biden administration. Moving on to today's significant activity roll-up in government. Nothing significant to report for the White House. The Senate and House don't begin committee hearings until tomorrow, but they do have a number of hearings coming up this week that have piqued my interest. I'll be reporting on those in future editions of Early Warning. Moving on to DHS, a U.S. district judge has ordered the Department of Homeland Security to begin accepting first-time DACA applications today. And his most recent ruling ensures that work permits are valid for 2 years for those DACA recipients. Moving on to the Defense Department, Acting Secretary of Defense Christopher Miller went to the Conference of the Defense Ministers of the Americas, where he called for stronger Western Hemisphere partnerships to counter Russian and Chinese coercion. Now, this is something we've reported on several times throughout the past several years. Then Defense Secretary Jim Mattis, then Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, and current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo have all toured Latin America echoing the same message. As a matter of fact, I think it was 2017? Rex Tillerson came here to the University of Texas at Austin and gave a speech where he explicitly invoked the new Monroe Doctrine. And that was the U.S. policy back during the 1820s, where official U.S. foreign policy was to keep major powers out of the Western Hemisphere, keep them out of Latin America. They didn't want Spain or some of these other countries to establish strongholds and make the likelihood of large-scale conflict. They didn't want to increase the likelihood of that happening, so it's just easier to keep everybody out. That has been the policy, essentially the policy of the Trump administration, especially warning these Latin American countries against taking these massive Chinese loans. China will come in like they're doing in Africa, they're doing in Latin America and a few other places around the world. They'll say, yeah, sure, we'll give you a $100 billion loan for economic development or to build this deep water port or to build this logistical hub in your country. And of course, these countries are never going to be able to pay off this debt. And essentially, they're going to remain under the thumb of China as a result. You know, most people think of colonization and conquest in terms of military or, occupation. China's version of conquest is through economic puzzles. They offer these countries these siren songs of economic development. These countries will never be able to pay back those loans. And in effect, these countries will become not a physical sense of colonialization, but economic colonialization. And that's going to expand China's power throughout the world. One thing I am highly interested in is whether or not a potential Biden administration is going to change course on countering Chinese influence, especially in Latin America. What the Trump administration has faced is a lot of these countries say, hey, I get it, but are you going to give us money? Are you going to give us a $100 billion loan? That's why the Trump administration, they've been working on doing these deals with the export-import banks and basically some sort of rival to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And really, the reason I bring it up is because this will have a massive global impact if the Biden administration is soft on China. Moving on, Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller also recently met with counterparts in Indonesia and the Philippines to discuss bilateral defense relationships and regional defense issues. Read that, Countering China. And on the same topic, the United States and Australia have signed the Cyber Training Capabilities Project Arrangement that enables U.S. Cyber Command to incorporate Australian Defense Force feedback into U.S. cyber wargaming systems. Now, Australia is, much like the United States and numerous other countries, they've been at odds with China over the past several years. That relationship has been further complicated between Australia and China. Over trade issues, Australia has also started becoming more friendly and deepening ties with the Japanese Defense Force, which has obviously riled Chinese sentiment. On a strategic level, one of my most important tasks really is to begin looking for indicators of what a Biden administration will do. Not just what they say they will do, but what they will actually do regarding China. Moving on to today's economic warning, Congress is looking at a one-week spending bill that would fund the government through 18 December. Supporters for a one-week funding bill say that it would provide an extra week for congressional leaders to agree on a long-term funding and COVID stimulus bill. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi recently admitted to holding out on a COVID stimulus bill for the past 6 months and says that she's now willing to cooperate with Republicans now that Joe Biden is expected to become president. And effectively, you have House Speaker Pelosi saying that she deliberately did not cooperate with Republicans. Basically, it appears in order to decrease the likelihood that President Trump would be reelected. This COVID stimulus bill has been held up by disagreements. One of the largest disagreements is over state and local COVID relief. You have Democrats who want to bail out states and cities who are experiencing fiscal or solvency issues. Those states and cities are mostly run by Democrats. Republicans do not want to bail out these states and cities. But it does appear that the sticking point has been resolved. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has now agreed to COVID relief to state and local governments, apportioned based on population and revenue loss. In other words, this is not just going to be a giant bloated bailout for New York City. The two sides right now, Democrats and Republicans, are trying to reach a solution on liability waivers. The best case scenario moving forward, though, is that Congress is able to agree on a 12-month funding bill. Short of that, Congress could pass another 3-month continuing resolution. Worst case scenario, Congress fails to meet the 11 December deadline, and they also fail to pass a COVID relief bill, which will result in much weaker economic conditions and possibly a recession next year. You have Moody's that came out last week, said that recession early next year is clearly on the table. You have a number of other economic and investment firms now saying that we're likely to experience economic contraction early next year. So obviously this economic, financial, and potentially monetary turmoil is far from over. On that topic, the summer was able to boast huge jobs gains during the strong recovery, but non-farm payroll employment has slowed significantly while we have headed into the fall. And I include a chart in this morning's report. Additionally, permanent job loss during the COVID crisis is rising at a higher rate than it did during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009 and the dot-com crash in 2000 and 2001. According to Oxford Economics, nearly 45% of those unemployed have been permanently laid off. Now, the official unemployment rate has fallen to 6.7%, but the U6 unemployment rate, which accounts for those who have dropped out of the job market entirely, has fallen to 12%, which is a much better reflection of the actual unemployment picture. Oxford reports the share of permanent job loss is likely to increase from the current rate of 45%. Now, for some context, just over 50% of all layoffs during the Great Recession were permanent. It does appear, when we consider the strong case for economic contraction in the first quarter of next year, that the labor market is going to be more permanently affected than it was during the Great Recession. We may see far above 50% of these job losses become permanent. Some economists, however, do remain hopeful that another round of COVID relief can be targeted towards job growth. But this permanent job loss is a reflection of permanent business closures, which likely means that additional stimulus and targeted relief is going to persist beyond this bill Congress is now considering. We may see numerous other rounds of stimulus and relief. We're seeing this slowing momentum in the labor market, and that likely puts a V-shaped recovery out of the range of possibilities. There's a lot of things that do resemble or are resembling a V-shaped. The bounce back in manufacturing is one area, but the jobs rate, as you can see on the chart here, is not looking like a V at all. Moving to today's low-intensity conflict intelligence summary, I have a special note here. I was looking at the data on labor force participation rate, youth unemployment, and some other charts. And one thing I've been warning for the past several years is the correlation between persistently high youth unemployment and the growth in low-intensity conflict. Because high youth unemployment is a universal early warning indicator of civil unrest. And sometimes that translates to political violence. It has in numerous other countries. Now, overall, the labor force participation rate has been on a downward trajectory since 2000. Acceleration of that decrease occurred after the 2008 recession. In other words, it got worse. It got far worse. And that downward trajectory is likely to continue past this COVID pandemic. Looking at unemployment, according to the latest Federal Reserve data, the non-seasonally adjusted youth unemployment rate has grown from 8.5% in 2019 to nearly 9% as of October 2020. That's about a 5% increase. Youth unemployment rates fell for 9 straight years from 2010 to 2019, but it has reversed that trend this year. And if current expectations are accurate, then youth unemployment is likely to continue rising due to slowdown of growth in the job market, persistent joblessness, rising numbers of permanent job losses. New jobs are probably going to be filled by older people who have more experience and better qualifications rather than younger people. So if the country does experience a sustained increase in youth unemployment, then we would experience that universal early warning indicator that historically precedes spikes in civil unrest. I look at guys like Ray Dalio, who've been saying that we may have a civil war or a revolution in this country. Ray Dalio, by the way, leads at least the United States' largest hedge fund, maybe the world's largest hedge fund. And he's been saying for the past several years, this conflict is basically going to be between socialists and capitalists. And I look at that warning, and I look at his expectations of stagnant economic growth and high inflation, and I think that is going to drive a lot of civil unrest. And really, the next decade, low-intensity conflict is going to persist. It is likely to get much worse in the future. Moving on, anti-fascists are attempting to prevent Trump supporters from obtaining lodging for the upcoming March for Trump rally in Washington, D.C. That's coming up on the 12th of December. Leftist groups are sharing contact information for area hotels as well as call scripts for activists to demand that hotels refuse service to anyone not wearing a mask and to require negative test results prior to entry. Activists are also demanding that these hotel chains publicly denounce white supremacy and the Proud Boys. Now, anti-fascists here are clearly trying to avoid a repeat of the Million MAGA March in November, where left-wing activists were confronted by large groups of Proud Boys and other Trump supporters. Looking at the atmospherics following that, you had a bunch of these leftist activists, a lot of these anti-fascists complaining that they were outnumbered, basically saying, hey, the next time this happens, we need to outnumber these guys 10-1. So it's clear here that anti-fascists are trying to limit the numbers of the pro-Trump crowd that's gathering. Moving on, a far-left chat room participant posted a guide to establishing an autonomous state. The guide was entitled Autonomy, Freedom, Solidarity. In the guide, leftists called for mass disruptions in a popular uprising in order to gain momentum towards revolution. According to the authors, in order to be ultimately successful, the far left must establish a counter-state of alternative institutions and resources to directly challenge legitimacy of the state. And this is a big thing, and I've been talking about. The left is very strong when it comes to building counter institutions. This is why they've created alternatives to a lot of right-wing, traditionally conservative or traditionally right-wing institutions. The far left's long-term goal here is a successful social revolution in the United States. They want to gradually challenge and replace the existing government. A lot of that change is starting at the local level. You have armed defense groups, armed leftists, riots, and a wide scope of propaganda that are aimed at undermining the government's legitimacy. In addition, we've seen these mutual aid programs, and they are really directed at building popular support for these socialist or these far-left movements. And that's another area where the left is quite strong. Some of the groups in the alt-right do community service projects and, community cleanups where they'll go clean up a river or they'll go, clean up a forest somewhere. And they'll publicize that. And these efforts among these alt-right groups are really aimed at softening the image of their groups. And this is what these leftist groups have been doing for a long time, building popular support through public service and community outreach. There's a reason why groups on both sides are doing this, because it works to build local communities. It works to build popular support for these groups. Moving on, Black Lives Matter chat room participants called for mass disruptions at prisons, jails, and detention centers across the country on New Year's Eve. Activists called for the abolition of prisons and said that they want to inspire prison riots via, quote, a raucous night of strong solidarity with those imprisoned by the state, end quote. The far left commonly targets prisons and detention facilities. Prison riots can consume a significant amount of government manpower and resources. More importantly, these riots could result in a disproportionate government response, which is a prime opportunity for the far left to exploit for propaganda value that leads to increased recruitment, popular support, and rhetorical attacks on the government's authority. And that does it for today's early warning report. Thanks for listening. We'll be back in your inbox tomorrow morning, back on this podcast tomorrow afternoon. Until then, be well and stay out front.